Hey folks, Ardwulf here. This is a new and highly intermittent series that I am calling Wargame Archaeology, where we walk our way through, give a little bit of a physical overview of some classic war games that I think the guiding rule here is probably that such examples will be generally pre-1980. And we have an example of that here today with The Next War from SPI. This is from 1978. And I'm always a sucker for a SPI soapbox if I don't have it and I see it at a good price. And I did here. This was on the Facebook Marketplace or Consim Marketplace on Facebook. This is a very interesting game. Design credits here are Jim Dunnigan, designer, and Mark Herman, developer, and graphic design, of course, by Redmond Simonson. I have a hunch this game feels like it's got a lot of Mark Herman in it. Let me put it that way. Super interesting design, and this is in what we call the SPI soap box or SPI detergent box. And that is a 4-inch bookcase box. I think in every case with a blank box bottom, although this one has some kind of weird texture on it, which I believe is still original, but I could be wrong. Now, this was sold to me as a... here's SPI Next War. The price, as I said, was pretty good. With good interior components, and the box is a little banged up. And I guess that's accurate, but I think this box, well, it's a little banged up. It's got a bit of a mushed corner here and a bit of a split corner here. And this could entirely split this corner, but it isn't split yet. And a little bit of bowing just on this side of the box. The other side sits pretty good. You can see somebody was selling this at some point for $100. I paid less than that. So this is modern conflict in Europe, I think intended to be in the early 80s. Now, I do have the spiritual successor to this game, which is the 1985 series from Thin Red Line Games that began with 1985 Under an Iron Sky, which basically has a very similar, if not absolutely identical, map footprint to The Next War. So let's open it up and see what we have in here. So first of all, we'll notice that we get a rule book, which clearly has been looked at, but is still in very, very nice shape. And then a scenarios and situation briefing. Now, the rule book here, this is pretty complicated by SPI's standards. Now, when I say that, some people will read that to think that this is monstrously complicated, and I don't think it is. It's complicated, but not monstrously complicated, because I think there's an idea floating around that SPI tended to do really, really complicated games. And while SPI did certainly do some very complicated games, they also did a lot of very simple games as well. Like all of the quads, for example, are really simple games, and those were very popular. This is a 32-page rule book with 3 or 4 pages at the end of, here is an air game example. And that's actually it. Designer's notes. We'll see if there's some designer's notes in the other book. And I had this years and years and years ago. And it was also in good shape. And I punched it and clipped it, and it was ready to go. And before it ever got the chance to hit a table, it got traded away. And I do in this case, usually I do not remember what the hell I did with something if I got rid of it. I just know that I got rid of it. In this case, I know that I traded it away for a copy of the 1975 TSR RPG Empire of the Petal Throne, which is still in my collection today, which is a very interesting game that I may do some additional video on at some point, but I've been thinking about that for years and it hasn't happened yet, so we'll see. The interesting mechanical idea here is that you have kind of a action point mechanism whereby you activate a unit and it has a number of action points available, which as far as I can tell are not on the counters. The counter iconography means you have an attack strength, a flak rating, and a defense strength. And I think the The number of action points you get is set by the unit type, as I recall, but I could be wrong about that. And then you spend those action points, and I'm not sure that's even what they're called, to do various things, including move or attack or do a couple of other things. So there's all kinds of things you can do here. And those points are, in fact, just called movement allowance. And the rule's actually right here. All land units have a basic movement allowance of 20 movement points, but you may exceed that by up to 30 movement points by employing fatigue movement. And then if we look at fatigue movement, you can you have a possibility of incurring fatigue, and they can affect the unit on 2 levels. And when it is in effect, the unit is hampered in movement and combat abilities. So that's interesting, and we'll see that the fatigue markers when we look at the counters. Now, there's this scenarios and situation briefing booklet as well, and this is actually a 40-page booklet. This is very hefty by SPI standards. I wouldn't swear that we never saw a thicker book than this from SPI, but it is definitely on the thicker side. Now, the whole situation, reflected and simulated by the game is hypothetical. So we actually have a lot of different scenarios here. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 scenarios, and then a campaign game, and then a additional sudden war scenario and a tension scenario. Oh, so there's actually more than that. So there's a lot here, right? All right, so situation briefing. Here's a Berlin scenario, which if we look, we see that it's one small area around Berlin. I would imagine there's a Vienna scenario, Baltic scenario, Fulda scenario, North German Plains scenario, Main Front scenario. I wonder to what extent this influenced or was influenced by the Central Front series, which was also at Dunnigan Design. And which I think had 3 games release under 2 or 3 games release under SPI, and then some of the successor companies released a couple games as well that were less well received. In the middle of the book, we have some charts and tables. Here's movement point costs, land combat results, function costs. Yeah, so here's your costs. This actually is all the things you spend movement on. In addition to movement, and that varies by terrain, you also have various function costs. You can break down or recombine. That costs movement points. You can remove fatigue. That costs movement points. It costs movement points for Warsaw Pact units to receive supply points. And then you have 4 different types or 3 different types of combat, standard, accelerated, and column assaults. And those all cost different amounts of movement points. And then you can attempt to disengage for 6 movement points. So really very interesting system here. And then we've got some more charts and tables, and then it looks like the same charts and tables again. So it looks like there is one 8.5 by 11, what we'll call it player age sheet that is tucked into the middle of the book. And it's nice to see these old games when things in the middle of the book have not been ripped out or even carefully pulled out. I'd rather do that myself if it comes up. Speaking of which, looking at the staples, a lot of times what you see with older games is staple rust. And I don't see any staple rust on here at all, with it sticking my enormous melon in front of the camera anyway. There might be a tiny bit of staple rust right there. So that's pretty good. See, this was, I feel like this was pretty well taken care of. But at the same time, this was a game that was not extraordinarily popular in its day. I think because it is pretty complicated, again, by the standards of SPI at the time. Which I think in late period SPI, they did lean more heavily into the more complicated games, but they never stopped making simple games. And that's a weird myth that has arisen that SPI games were generally complicated. That's really not true. So it looks like we got some optional stuff here. We also have this situation briefing, which looks like it is a combination of player's notes as well as sort of mapping out the hypothetical situations that the game includes. There is a pretty extensive bibliography here, which is always nice to see. We also have some listings of orders of battle. And unit organization charts, which is a nice reference. I want to say that, exactly how the division of labor worked in this game, I don't know. Maybe we should ask Mark about that. But I do feel like this is a very well-developed game, again, by SPI standards. Now, usually the soapboxes, in my experience anyway, came with counter trays. And this, in fact, does have 2 counter trays. I'm going to be very and they're kind of packed for storage here and not packed for store counters, because they're kind of nested together. And another thing that we will often see with counter trays this old, whether they're SPI counter trays or not, is that the plastic has turned brittle. And this doesn't feel like that. This feels like it was kept in a environment that had good humidity control. We also have the 2 very cute, adorable, tiny SPI D6s, which I do not have a lot of, because a lot of times you buy these older games, and none of my SPI games that I have right now are like original to my collection, right? They're all games that I've reacquired or acquired for the first time in the last 8 or 10 years, or whatever it's been. So this is very difficult to extract, actually, and I think I'm not going to try to do it on camera. But in any case, these are in really, really nice shape, other than some dust on the bottom. So we'll set these dice aside for safekeeping, too. Like I said, I don't have a lot of those. Now, we do have this 4-panel air allocation display, where we have a NATO side and a Warsaw Pact side in the different air sectors: Baltic, North, Central, and South. And bear in mind, this is all kind of central. The theater here is all Central Germany, or Germany. It's kind of all of Germany, neighboring areas, and Denmark. So as I don't have room to set the whole map up at the moment, but we'll take a look at the map. And it's a really nice looking map too. One can, I think, safely assume that it is a Redmond-Simonson map. There are 3. No, there's more than that. There are. Oh, look at this. What do we got here? This is the Next War Addenda, which is the friendlier word for errata. And this is a 4-page War 1, 8.5 by 11, if you wish, thing. And then here is the awesome SPI Customer Service Return Card, 257 Park Avenue South. Imagine the day when a wargame publisher could afford an office on Park Avenue in New York City. Customer service card, inspect all the components, a bunch of questions here. That's actually pretty neat. We'll save that for future amusement purposes. So we have 3 full-size maps. These are going to be roughly, 23 by or 22 by 34. And then we have 2 sort of bump-out maps that add to the map area. And in this case, it's the map area in Austria around Vienna, and up here near Gdansk, or what used to be called Danzig, and Kaliningrad, which I think they've misspelled, actually. It's Kaliningrad, which, of course, is what used to be Königsberg in East Prussia. The maps themselves, which one should I bust out? I think we'll bust out this one. Are very characteristic SPI maps of the era, and I do feel like the paper has yellowed a little bit, but not critically so. This is actually not the one I'm going to bust out. We'll try this one. Yeah, we'll try this one instead. This one has the northern more parts of the theater here, or at least the central. This is not the northern map. This is the south map, or the central map, I should say. This is the central map. So we've got West Germany in here. We've got East Germany over here. We've got a little bit of Poland over here. We've got a little bit of France and the Low Countries over here, including Luxembourg. So you can see the, sort of massive urban and industrial concentration here in Western Germany, in the Ruhr and the Rhineland. Probably some folks will consider this maybe a little primitive looking. And I do think it's probably a bit busy, but I will also say that I think it's a really very nice map. And that's one of the reasons I picked this thing up in the first place back in the 90s. Well, even I didn't have the original, when it originally came out. I picked this thing up. I'm not sure if bought is the right word, but because I don't remember how I got it. I just remember how it left. But I'm pretty sure I did buy it, and I want to say that I was probably in an Origins auction years ago. But by the standards of its day, I think this is a really nice looking map. And even by modern standards, I think it remains looking pretty good. So whenever one can find, as far as I'm concerned, whenever one can find the big SPI games, right, for less than $100, assuming too that they're not in horrifically bad condition, which is of course sometimes the case. I'm probably gonna continue to pick them up when that happens. I'm not buying duplicates. I'm not gonna be the guy that has 6 copies of Campaign for North Africa or War in the Pacific or whatever. But I have War in the Pacific, and I'm glad I do. And this is internally my War in the Pacific, which I did a video on, so check that out if you're interested. Internally, my War in the Pacific's in really good shape, but the box is in horrific condition. I guess it could be worse in that there's no blown corners, but it's beat up. So here we have American units, and this is kind of the standard, not universal, all right? Not every SPI game has this sort of matte finish style counters, but a lot of them did, and particularly all the later ones did. And I've always really liked this sort of feel of these counters. Although, because of the matte finish, I have a hunch that they won't wear well, but I personally cannot attest to that. Because I don't think that, like I said, none of my SPI games are like the ones that I originally had dating back to the early 80s. And none of the ones I picked up in the 90s or since then have seen enough play for me to evaluate that. But we've got Americans here. We've got what looks like American air assets versus American ground assets. And we can see there's some flak units in here as well, and or some rocket units, that kind of stuff. We have a small contingent of Canadians. Jeff Beeler, you'll be very happy to see that, in 2 different colors as well. Here's West Germans in 2 different colors. We've got this sort of color for the land units, this sort of color for what I take to be air units. I think that's accurate. And then these, of course, will be double-sided. And one of the things that kind of you got to think about, right, when looking at SPI counters is what's the registration like? Because sometimes it was disastrously bad. That is not the case on this counter sheet. Here's we have a second counter sheet. This is counter sheet 2B front, 2B back. So this is 1A. So why is it 2A? Okay, got it. So SPI also did this sort of large format counter sheet, which was unusual but not unique at the time. Some OSG games actually had counter sheets like this too. And actually TSR adopted something similar, at least for a while, although they were clearly using a different printer. So 2A is the top, 2B is the bottom. It's not more complicated than that. So we got France, again, in 2 different colors. Contrast on these, it's another thing that you maybe need to think about with SPI counters. Contrast looks good. There's print that's pretty small, but I don't feel like anything here is like unreadable. We've got UK here, some Belgians and Dutch, Danes in 3 different colors for the Danes, actually. The Austrians over here, the Italians over here. And once again, registration is perhaps not perfect, but it's very good from what I'm seeing so far. Yeah, this one's a little bit off, but not problematically so. So here is ground units of the USSR. And there's, as you can imagine, for this topic, kind of a lot of them. I take these to be naval units, by the way. That's very interesting. And then we've got these air units and these air units. These may be naval air. That's plausible. That's possible. And then when we look at the backs, once again, now something I'm noticing, if we look at, say, this counter right here at the top, it's right side up here, it's upside down here. So these are going to be I'm not really sure why, but it is unusual for counters to have this sort of flip vertically mechanism. Usually you flip it from side to side and the top edges of the counter are aligned on both sides. That's not the case here. It is almost always the case today, but I can think of exceptions. Decision Games version of Wacht am Rhein, for example, has the flip vertically counters. And when we were playing that, it drove me absolutely nuts. So here we got some more Soviets. We've got East Germans in 3 different configurations. It looks like Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, more Czechs and Poles. So lots of Warsaw Pact representation here. Once again, registration looks good. I'm being a little delicate with the counter sheet because you never know when these things might pop out. They weren't fixed that tightly. We've got 2 sheets of markers, and there's, again, I would say the registration on this one's not the best, but again, it's not like I got to write SPI an angry letter and demand a replacement counter sheet. So, and they did not, as a general rule, replace these unless they were unusable, and this is not unusable. So we've got some road mode markers here, breakthrough markers. We've got these number markers. I'm not sure what these represent. Fuel markers, out of ammo markers, various mines and stuff. Anything interesting on the back? More statuses for flak and stuff like that. No Zoc is on the back of the breakthrough counters. Here are your fatigues, and you can go up to fatigue level 2, and it costs a lot of movement points to recover from fatigue. And then, actually, I like that they told you this. So this is counter sheet 5A, and there are 2 identical 5As. And once again, the registration on this one looks a little bit better. But again, the other one wasn't too bad. It's a little bit off, but we're losing a little bit of text over here. That's irritating. But it's not the end of the world either. I'm actually more irritated by the flip vertically counters. Just because, the muscle memory for doing that, it just isn't there, right? Much easier to flip horizontally, just because that's what we're used to, right? It's not more complicated than that. So we do have these 6 counter sheets then, and remember that SPI counter sheets, they're not double-sized, but there's 200 on the top and 200 on the bottom, so they're 400 sheet counter sheets. A configuration that today is very unusual, but wasn't necessarily back in the day. So anyway, I think that we've seen all that we're going to see out of the next war. My sort of justification for picking this up is that it is a really interesting system mechanically. I would like to kind of investigate that mechanic in its original form, or at least archaic form, rather than experiencing it through the revised lens of, say, a 1985 Under Iron Sky. And I will point out that I think I've cracked one of the counter trays trying to extract them from each other. So we will put this back together off camera. I want to thank you for watching. I want to give a special shout out to the patrons of Ardwulf's Lair, without whose assistance, support, and encouragement, it would be impossible to continue doing the stuff that we do here. So thank you, patron. Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy wargaming.